So in the last lesson I challenged you to create a number variable and store this number inside it, and then use Adobe LiveDocs to find out how to truncate it to 2 decimal places. Then cast it to a string and then concatenate it with a currency sign to give this result. So let's see how you would go about doing that. So I've set up the same application that I've used in the last couple of lessons. Window Actions to see the action script. You can see I've set up the variable here, var my variable :number equals the number, and I'm using the number casted to a string to set the text property of the output text field on the stage. So if I control test that, you can see it's being displayed. But I only want part of it to be displayed, so I'm going to look at Adobe LiveDocs, which I have here. You would have to first search for number inside the search box there. I already have number showing. It's AS3 which I want, ActionScript 3. I have the runtime selected, Flash Player. So I'm just going to scroll down a bit because the function I want is this toFixed function. I could click on it to see more details, but basically it's just going to set it to a certain number of decimal places. So if I go back to Flash and then I put toFixed 2, then I could control test that. You notice that I've got it cast to a string here. In fact, it turns out when I look at the function and the output of the function is not a number this time, it's a string already. So I'm using a function with a string output, which means I don't need to cast it to a string. So I'm just going to take that out. I'm going to control test again, and you can see there it is now working. And I'm going to put my currency sign in, concatenate it with a plus. I could use a concat function, but that basically completes the challenge. So let's go back to the slides, because in this lesson I want to talk about functions, and I'll be coming back to the toFixed function in a minute. But first I'd just like to talk about the basic syntax of a function. The function keyword, then you would give the function a name. By convention it starts with a lowercase letter, and any other words start with a uppercase letter. Parentheses are then used, open and closing, then a colon, and then an output type. In this case, void means that there's no output. Then there are an opening and closing curly bracket, and then there's some code within those brackets. And to execute that code, you have to write elsewhere in the program outside the brackets. Normally anyway, you would then write the function name, my function, use the parentheses and the semicolon. So, why use functions? Well, you would use functions when you want to use code more than once in the program. And the reason you would do that is it saves time writing code. You can just call the same function again and again. You are less likely to make errors if you just use functions rather than rewriting your code. Your code also becomes easier to read, especially if your function names correspond to what your functions do. You also have to use functions in certain circumstances. For example, we've come across this before when using event listeners. We used functions to listen to those events. And I'm now going to talk about functions with inputs and outputs. So I've shown you the basic structure of a function. This is a function with inputs and an output. You can actually only have one output with a function. But the inputs go inside the parentheses. You can tell the function what you want to call your inputs. They can be any name you give them. They're separated by a comma. You also, like for a variable, you have to use a colon and then give it a variable type. The same with the output. You use a colon, you give the output a variable type. This particular function adds the two inputs together and stores that inside a newly declared variable, and then it returns that variable. The return statement is required when there is an output type, so when it's not a void, and inside the return statement you have to have something with the same type, in this case an int, as you specify in this statement here, with the output type being an int. And the way to execute this code, to add those two inputs together and return the output, the sum of those two, you have to use the function name, but you also have to include in the parentheses the inputs, and they have to be integers. So I've used an example of 1 and 2 separated by a comma, and I've made that function equal to a newly declared variable, which I've made as an int, and that is going to store the output of this function into that variable. I'm just going to go back to the toFixed function, because if you look as part of the information, you can see the same kind of syntax being used here. So function toFixed, then there's parentheses. Inside the parentheses there is a type of integer, and that's where I put the number of decimal places that I wanted to set a number to. And the output to this function of a number is a string, and that's why I didn't have to cast the output to a string, because it was already a string. So you can use this information here to find out what type of input you have to put inside the parentheses of a function and what type of output you will get when you use it. So let's have a look at an example in Flash. It's the same type of application as usual, and I've set up the addition function here. Function add numbers, open parentheses, close parentheses. Inside there's two inputs, both of type integer. The output of the function is an integer. The function declares a variable, adds the two inputs together and stores the result inside the newly declared variable, and returns the variable as the output, the output being an int as specified. So when I call this function, which I do at the top here, in the slide I did it underneath, it doesn't matter whether it's above or below the function when I call it. I'm calling it here, and I'm having as the inputs 1 and 2 as I showed on the slides. The output to this function is being stored in a newly declared variable here called myCalculation, and I'm using that variable inside a second function that I've created called printOutput. That's the function down here that has one input, so this myCalculation becomes this to print. So this can be confusing at first. When you call a function, you put in a variable name. That variable is copied into whatever you call the input in the function parentheses. So this to print becomes the same as the contents of myCalculation. So when I call this, I'm sending the value, well, it's 1 plus 2, I'm sending 3 into the printOutput function, and 3 is then being used in this statement. So the number 3 is being cast to a string, and then the 3 in a string format is being used to set the text property of the output text field. So when I control test, the output is 3. One other thing you need to be aware of when using functions is something called variable scope. And all that variable scope means is that if you declare a variable outside functions, they are accessible both outside and inside functions. However, if you declare a variable inside a function, that variable is only accessible between the two curly brackets. And in fact, variable scope just doesn't just refer to functions, but in any case where these curly brackets are used, the scope of a variable is limited by these curly brackets. So if I removed that comment sign and used this variable here and removed the same variable from there, I wouldn't be able to refer to this variable elsewhere in the program outside this function, because the scope is from that position to this point, and then it's inaccessible beyond that closing curly bracket. So in summary, I've shown you functions of objects using the dot syntax, which you can refer to in LiveDocs, for example, the toFixed function. But I've also shown you how to write your own functions, including functions with both inputs and an output. And if you use an output, you must use the return statement. And as I mentioned, one of the key advantages of using functions is to avoid the unnecessary repetition of code. And we'll be using functions throughout our coding in ActionScript over the next few lessons. But in the next lesson, I want to talk about something else. I want to talk about something called an if statement.